коллеги, спасибо за
Hello.
приглашение на данное мероприятие.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Вдвоем сделаем доклад, я сделаю в первую
We'll
часть
make the presentation
больше
together.
бизнесовую, а Сергей уже
I'll deliver the first part, which is a bit businessy, and Sergey will give you the tech
Очень
details.
интересно было слушать предыдущие доклады.
It's been very interesting to follow the previous presentations, where people would say that various tools should help you find hosts and computers. However, in the life of an IT person or an InfoSec person, there will be lots and lots of physical elements you will never be able to find with auto-discovery tools. It could be very difficult, for example, for you to discover which rack holds a particular server and even which server room it is in, let alone discovering this for cables. So we're here to share what we as experts believe on this subject, and we'll also tell you, why it could matter to you in information security. My name is Evgeny Krivonosov. I'm the CEO of SDI Soft. Sergey is our CTO. And for quite some time, we've been working together. Before that, I was the head of BMC, where Sergey was the CTO. And we helped our clients do automation of IT processes. And one of the big challenges we had was around doing cataloging or inventory of IT assets. Quite often, when we completed our projects, it could be CMDB installation or a service desk. We would have people approach us, telling us, you've got great tools, everything is nice, but where should we document our cables? Where should we best describe our DC plan? And how do we calculate max loads for the floors of the DC? Like, can you imagine that we're doing migration from one type of equipment to another one, and if we go, say, for new blades and they turn out to be heavier, what if they break through the floors? Naturally, the InfoSec world is quite complex. We use different methods for assessing risks and what have you. But you need a strong foundation in any case, and this foundation is made of IT infrastructure. So in order for this foundation to be something sturdier than a quicksand, you need to be sure that the information that you have is actually reliable and complete. So what we see, as we work with large geographically distributed organizations, which could be suffering from lack of talent, is that, sometimes they are dealing with poor quality information, blatantly false information. So how do we minimize the number of errors and mistakes related to that?
Процитирую коллег из известного фильма «В чем сила». Действительно важно, чтобы, как и у служб...
Now, what matters is that both IT and InfoSec people should have an aligned view of both their physical and their logical assets and the relations between them. I love quoting this particular case. During an incident, a device was compromised during the night. So, a security officer makes a call saying, we cannot disconnect this port. You got to go to the site and physically, disconnect it from the patch cord. And he tells him, well, you got to tell us which port for sure. He says, well, sure, no problem. We have the IP address. Now, facility management people say, we need to hear from you exactly which room, which rack, which unit, and which physical port you'd need us to unswitch, so to speak. And many companies really do not know answers to such questions or spend quite some time looking for such answers. Now, we're here to tell you how you can do that, what kind of methods are available.
Информация
Also,
об инфраструктуре физически, она
information on infrastructure is physically unavailable at times because, sometimes it's all in the heads or on paper. And when people start looking for this information, they start wondering if it is correct or not. And they will say, well, yesterday we had this outsourced people, and do we really trust the stuff they wrote there? What's the status of this data? So the big question here is like, what's the authorization, so to speak? Was this information collected by a robot? Can we trust the robot? Is there a signature of somebody who checked that? So the big question is, how can we have trust in the information on the infrastructure that's available? Now, the questions I will try to answer with this presentation are like this. Where do you find the information that you need, like which systems? What makes it special? To what extent can you trust it? How can you improve its quality? And how to select the best option. Thank you. That's it for me. Over to you, Sergey. Good evening. Or is it still good afternoon? It's still good afternoon.
Мне сказали по сцене не ходить, иначе.
I've been told not to walk around the stage. Apparently, operators will have, the cameraman will have a hard time. So, as an InfoSec person, you need to learn from IT which assets they have, how these assets are connected, how data gets transmitted from point A to point B. This information comes to InfoSec from IT. When you request this data,
во-первых, что вам необходимо получить, какого рода информацию.
It's important to sort of control for the kind of information you want to get and also for the veracity of information they are supplying you with. Interestingly enough, the previous speaker
Учета активов. Интересно, что мы будем сейчас
talked about
что-то похожее, но называть
an IT asset cataloging system, and we'll be talking about something very similar using very different terms, which is a good example of people working in the same industry talking about the same thing using different lingo. In order for people to avoid such situations, we decided to present this report on the kind of inventory systems IT people have, what kind of data you can grab there, and what to remember about such data. Now, as we analyze configuration data, what should we care about?
Являются ли эти данные, которые отвечают на вопрос, как
the big question is whether it's descriptive or prescriptive. Like, is it what we really found, or is it what it should be? Funnily enough, InfoSec and IT people will often confuse these two notions. So they may get some data and they will try to make decisions based on it. But it may easily be that, this information is, so to speak, operational, but kind of illegal. Like, you can collect information that you have like 100 devices connected to the network without knowing how many devices should be there. Acting on this data could be weird. Now, the next question is how up-to-date this information is. Is it holistic? Sometimes you get information, but it's incomplete. So, for example, when you work with a server personnel, you will ask them how many servers they have, physical and virtual, you get some answer. And then it turns out that they've only told you about a single site, or they forgot about one server, and then they won't tell you that, some servers have been disconnected or have been taken away for repairs. So very often the answers you get will be incomplete. How correct it is. Now, such accounting or inventory information will always contain mistakes. Just treat it as a fact. Human factor plays a role here. There are some technical reasons why this is the case. You just need to be mindful of that. And also remember that information can be outdated and know that much of the data will be wrong. So when you get some information, it's a good idea to check if it's actual information, if it's planned, if it's historical data, or if it's a dream about what the company would like to have in 2 years' time. For example, when you ask people about how many servers they have, you can get all sorts of answers.
Мне нравится эта картинка, как раз мы работали в компании.
I love this picture. Worked with the DMC, and back in DMC, they developed this diagram which showed some, essential IT operations and the key tools used to automate them. What you can see here is that at the very center, at the very core of it all, you should have some, asset inventory system or a CMDB, configuration management database, or CMS, configuration management system. Now, the idea is that you should have, some single point of storage, a single database. It can effectively consist of several different tools, but it should concentrate information on everything from IT services to some engineering elements that you have in the power boards, for example. So this is where actual current data should go. And it should be a one-stop shop for everybody interested in up-to-date information. So this is where you would certainly want to be. In reality, the situation, however, is slightly different. Like most companies are building CMDB. Like you can check out what the biggest companies in Russia are doing. Everybody who has at least 2,000 people working for them will be using CMDB. But for smaller companies, like smaller niche products can be used. Or alternatively, you can see niche tools used side by side with CMDB, like providing extra granularity. So there is always a place for systems like this. They have a niche, they have a role to play. But please remember that if you're only getting data from CMDB, you can miss out on some interesting information. Now let's talk in more detail about the key elements shown here and the kind of data you can find there. And we'll compare them using the criteria listed before. Let's start with CMDB.
Переводят ITSM-форум как БДКЕ, база данных конфигурационных элементов. Она изначально разрабатывалась, по теории,
Now, CMDB,
про ITIL, как некое хранилище.
According to ITIL, was initially designed as a storage of information for on IT services, as well as key IT elements whose functioning drives IT services. Now, this is the fundamental philosophy of the product. Naturally, they're trying to put everything in CMDB now. Sometimes they put even cables and ports in CMDB, but this is the initial design, so to speak, or purport of the system that should tell you what kind of data should go into it. A proper description of how data is stored there is shown here. So if you have some individual inventory assets there, could be applications or hardware, an IT service or information system, what have you, it should have a card associated with it with some attributes written in it. And you can also store links between these cards. Key type of links is dependencies. So servers will depend on something, and like applications will depend on servers, and services will depend on applications. What's characteristic of this system is that it's positioned as a single point of truth. And this information is positioned as authorized, quote unquote. It sort of tells you what the IT infrastructure should be like, so it's kind of prescriptive. It usually has significant coverage, and data is usually normalized so that similar data should be stored in a similar way. Like, that's actually important for, say, Cisco devices to have normalized descriptions. Now, the system should be scalable flexibly if you need to add, say, a new asset. like a chair or whatever, you should be able to do that easily. The system is neat because you can consolidate data from different sources there. You can also regulate access, like I said, one-stop shop.
Практика ее использования показывает, что те люди, которые занимаются
Now, the people who
они
are
редко
responsible for CMDB implementation,
шасси оборудования. То есть
they rarely go below the level of equipment chassis. So if you need, for example, to learn which power units or cables
то вы, скорее всего,
or circuit boards your equipment is running, in all probability you won't find it in CMDB.
инженерную инфраструктуру. Если
It doesn't really provide proper coverage of the network side, so to speak.
найдете, либо они будут в таком виде, который
In all probability, you won't be able to find enough information on, say, IP
которые фактически
and ports and what have you. But because maintaining this data is usually manual,
введя данные в виде учетных карточек,
so it's quite a headache. You know, as you create those inventory cards, it's very easy to make the following mistake. So our client will send us information on the equipment they have in the rack. So we have a rack 42U. Now we do a simple calculation, and it tells us that the total size is like 80 units, all installed frontally. Now, if something, breaks down, they start looking for a specific set of equipment, but obviously you cannot squeeze 80 units into a 42U rack. So such mistakes are pretty common in CMDBs because checking this information manually could be difficult. You do need to run a manual direct audit. Now, CMDB is a very good thing. Please don't get me wrong, you need it. However, you got to be mindful of the existing constraints. In order to expand the capabilities of CMDB, they're often run side by side with other systems. They're sometimes called technical inventory systems. Have you ever heard DCIM? Good. Data center infrastructure management, I think. So if you need to do this cataloging of your racks and your equipment, which equipment sits in which rack, connection to the comms systems, as well as the cooling systems, HVAC, and so on. Now, NRI is a telecom system for documenting your communication channels. So if you have like two sites, it's good for you to know, what kind of cables you're using and so on. Now, there is also a specialized system for kind of accounting for all the cables and cable infrastructure used by telecom operators. There is also IPAM for IP address management. Now, compare CMDB to these babies. Naturally, the key sort of building blocks they use are very different. Like here you have very high level of detail, like you are going down to lambdas or units. So if you need to address a specific problem, like you need to disconnect some physical piece of equipment, you got to know where it's sitting and where it's connected to. Such systems, now can you imagine the screens here? Information in such systems tends to be much more detailed, and it's usually visualized differently so that operators can use it. So, for example, you can add new boards or new pieces of equipment from the front side of the rack, and this is something you simply cannot do in other systems. What's interesting about the systems is that the data you will find in such systems is usually kind of prescriptive or authorized. So only authorized users commit data there. Like if you need to find an answer to what the cable infrastructure should be like and what should be connected, that's the kind of systems to go for. Now, these systems usually contain the so-called typological controls. Remember, I gave this example previously of 80 units in a 42U rack. Now, in such systems, there usually are some logical controls for that. You're not allowed to add more equipment to a rack that appears completely full. Moreover, you won't be allowed to do a connection of, say, a power socket to, say, a cable wire.
обладает достаточной жесткостью. Если вы
However, the systems
новые типы объектов
are
учета,
pretty
тогда
rigid.
добавить
Like if
более
you
сложно.
want to add new types of assets, you may discover
Следующая
you cannot do that.
крупная группа систем, или,
Another major group of systems
которая обладает функциями автодискаверинга, это система, которая
are the so-called auto-discovering
в режиме опроса
systems.
оперативно пойти и определить все
So with them,
устройства, все
you
устройства,
can
которые
quickly
подвергаются какой-то
discover
сети,
all the
рисовать сетевую
devices
топологию, там,
that will talk to you on IP and do it topology L2 and L3.
вот облако пингвинов, которое по центру.
I love this cloud of
Вот у
penguins
вас
you can see
Discovery,
here.
пожалуйста, пользуйтесь, это очень
So this is how
полезно.
discovering
Много хороших
works,
данных.
and it does provide you with lots of good
Некоторые
data.
являются более продвинутыми, они могут
Some systems are more advanced. For example, they can test the kind of software installed on desktops or servers, or even how this software talks to each other, which ports it is using, which protocols.
Средств дискаверинга очень широкий.
Now, the range of things auto-discovery tools can give you is quite broad. Now, let's quickly look at some tools you can find in this bucket.
Либо универсальные средства дискаверинга,
Some tools are universal, like versatile.
там, начиная от топологии L2 и заканчивая
They can discover
приложением,
anything from L2 to traffic or applications or channels connecting
Бывают узкопрофильные
various
системы,
applications. But they could be like narrow focus systems that do, more narrow discovery.
дискаверинга на самом деле часто
Such auto-discovery functions
системами мониторинга, потому что вы когда
you will
ставите
often
систему
find
мониторинга,
equipped with monitoring
первым делом
systems.
пробежаться, про сетевую,
So a
допустим,
monitoring system
пробежаться по сети, найти сетевые
will
устройства,
first do a quick scouting if your network will talk to those network devices for auto-discovery purposes, obviously. And
спасибо коллегам.
some of them were mentioned in the previous speech.
Соответственно, таких систем мониторинга очень много, они самые разные.
Numerous monitoring systems fall into this basket.
Есть системы управления оборудованием от производителей.
Now, there are also some
Там Starajar,
equipment management systems.
управлять не просто как отдельными коробками, а как комплексами.
So, for example, if you want to run your Hitachi or EMC equipment not individually, but rather in bands, so to speak, well, you can do that as well. So most large vendors have network management systems which enable you to create networks or create groups for management simplification purposes. In the same group of auto-discovery, I should also list management systems that we're calling domain systems here, such as virtualization, which will do configuration and creation of virtual servers, but they will also be able to do this querying of the virtualization environment, and we'll ask them about their state. So there are numerous domain systems like this. What's special about such systems? When it comes to data, well, they collect data automatically, which means you can do it at high frequency. You can also hope that this data is up to date.
Системы универсальные дискаверинга, они бывают на
Now these are versatile auto-discovery systems. They are often configurable, which means that if you want to look for your application which provides a specific response, you can set up a rule that will help you identify it running on a particular workstation, for example.
Или система от производителей.
Next one is specialized domain systems. Now they know exactly which objects they are managing, so they can provide you with very detailed information, all the way down to, specific memory strips.
Принципиальный момент, что с одной стороны они собирают данные автоматически.
Note that they collect data automatically, and they provide you with the current information, whatever they've been able to find, which means that they don't really know what your landscape should be. So if you are asking your discovery system the question of how many servers should I have and are all of them in place, your discovery system can only tell you how many it has discovered right now. Information in most cases will not be authorized, meaning that its legitimacy cannot be validated. Authorization means that, somebody endowed with certain power has attested to the veracity of this information, which means that this data needs to be kind of audited or authorized in some other way. With software, for example, if we are discovering operating systems, you will get information that this machine is running Windows such and such. Now, depending on the locale, you will be seeing sort of very different figures, although it may be running, or they may all be running the same operating system. So standardizing data format can be difficult. Like, you can get different responses from very similar systems. Like, if you want to know how many different Windows machines you have without normalization, you will see significant, non-existent or illusory variability. Discovery doesn't tell you all. Naturally, InfoSec people do not want to allow the systems to enter your protected segments. So naturally, there will be some equipment which is not exposed to the internet. Naturally, you won't see the equipment which is in the warehouse or disconnected in the rack. There is also an issue with data interpretation.
Характерный пример. У нас
A typical example.
из реального проекта. Стоят две платы, у них разные ревижены.
We have two boards, they have different revisions.
По одной плате мы получаем
Discovering is done, and you get all the information on one board. And for the other one, all we hear is that, there is a board, it has some ports.
Поэтому
And the only difference they have is, in the firmware. Interestingly enough, this discovery is done by the vendor's tools. So please remember that discovery tools are good, they're useful, but they won't tell you all the truth. Or what can also happen is that your auto discovery tools will register a new device, but they won't know what this device is. And finally, InfoSec people hate them because they believe that discovery tools are like spies, sniffing your network out. Moreover, they create issues for the InfoSec while belonging to the IT. And the final group of data sources that I wanted to cover today is poorly structured sources such as paper documents, project documentation, and it could be, in CAD or in Visio or BIM data. BIM is beautiful. So we still need to use such data sources, don't we? Because the information you find in them tends to be authorized. Like, if you get project documents, great. This is, or at least should be, the source of truth on what your DC should be like. So as you use it, you should be able to collect a lot of diverse data. But then keeping it up to date is extremely difficult. Nobody, for example, is going to redraw your BIM information. Moreover, you need to have licenses for this stuff. You need to know how to use this software. And if you need to find something in such an unstructured document, that sounds like a huge headache.
Если вот у нас 11 минут осталось,
We have 11 minutes left.
если подводить итог, то в принципе на самом деле ситуация хорошая. Потому что, если брать крупные организации...
All in all, the situation seems to be pretty good. Look at the large corporations. In Russia, most of them have CMDB, and this CMDB is used a lot, and many operational processes rely on CMDB. Information from CMDB is sent to InfoSec and other people. The problem, however, is that the large players have previously been using Western equipment or Western systems, and Russian players are trying to substitute for that, but it's not happening in a perfect way. Now, besides CMDB, all the tools I've mentioned are also being used because there is need for them. Now, expectations when it comes to auto-discovery tend to be very inflated. Very often we hear from IT people that they want to have a system that will collect everything so that we can just sit on our hands doing nothing. That's a blue dream, isn't it?
Хотел обратить внимание, что процессная зрелость вот на различных
I also want to stress that process maturity in areas such as servers or network infrastructure will differ greatly. This is something that was mentioned by some previous speakers. It will have an impact on the level of detail and the tools being used and the level of quality of the data you're going to get.
В итоге вот весь этот учет, он становится таким фрагментарным. Ну, не в
In the end, this, cataloging or inventory you will have will be kind of fragmented. There will also be white spots,
Если домены
blind spots.
пересекаются, то есть данные об
If domains overlap,
системах, то
if data on the same object comes from two different systems, you will often see that the data conflicts. What's characteristic, what's common is that, for example, network equipment will belong to two different systems. If you start looking at port numbers, you will be flabbergasted to see that different systems give you different port numbers.
Вы получаете данные
For a different example, you get data on a RAM in server, and one tool will, two tools will potentially give you different numbers of megabytes.
Учитывайте это в своей жизни.
Or at least, one will be dealing in megabytes, the other will be dealing with gigabytes.
Как бы это наследие 90-х, когда мы потеряли контроль над
Now
инфраструктурой.
we see it as the heritage of the 90s because we lost control over infrastructure in the 90s.
Есть в одной точке, это всегда
We're trying to consolidate
мусор мы в одной
everything in the same point.
Те, кто
And,
уже занялись консолидацией, собрали
The risk here is that we'll be bringing some garbage in. So those who have already structured consolidation, they're now looking at the quality of this information. Like, is it authorized or is it up to date?
Смешение присутствует. Если люди не различают, что это за данные, вы можете получить ответ, который, вообще говоря, не
Now, if people do not understand the difference between current information and authorized information, you can easily be confused. Apples and
Во
oranges.
многих случаях, когда мы видим,
Incompleteness of data, I've mentioned this already.
оценивается с точки зрения полноты. Возвращаясь к идеальной картине, вот, которая была
Now let's go back to the ideal situation, something we described previously. Now this particular slide
заказчика, компания Volkswagen, она приезжала сюда, выступала, рассказывала о том, как у них
belongs to Volkswagen. So Volkswagen talked previously about the cataloging that they do, and naturally they presented it in a different language, so we had to translate the slide. So
в центре всего IT-ландшафта
at the very core of their IT landscape,
эксплуатации две системы, которые
used by the operations people, they have two systems, which they call configuration management system, and they're closely related. One is a technical accounting system, the other is CMDB, so they exchange information, and these two systems provide information for ITSM process and incident management, and also for various monitoring systems so that they can assess the criticality of a particular failure, but also InfoSec teams and for those who develop and design IT infrastructure. And they collect data from different sources in order to make sure that everything they have is up to date. So they will pull, for example, corporate references and lots of other sources. So they use this incoming information to augment the data in the two systems or to verify it. So they compare the current information they collect to what they have in CMDB. Interestingly enough, Volkswagen adopted this architecture a long time ago, and their technical accounting system is the primary one, the master system, so to speak. Only after that, they feed it to CMDB, and the reason they named for that is that technical accounting system provides better data quality, fewer mistakes. Well, because there are numerous checks in place there.
Последний слайд.
This is my last slide.
Как безопасники, вы определите.
Now, when you're making your decisions as InfoSec people, you got to decide what kind of information you need from the IT. Like, is it current or authorized? Are you prepared to act on the basis of incomplete information? Because incomplete is what you're going to get in most cases. If the information contains mistakes,
Ну и получая
What level of mistakes are you comfortable with? And when you're getting information from IT, double check it. Also consider the majority of processes, whether data is authorized, how complete data is, how correct it is, and which data source it is coming from.
Получаете. Вот, собственно, там основная часть доклада.
This is pretty much it.
Говорил Михаил, да пребудет с вами сила.
And just like Mikhail said, let the power be with you. Let the force be with you.